I'm Lindy Blackburn, 38, and I lost everything in 3 hours on June 14, 2017. My husband, David, called me at 1:47 a.m. from the 18th floor of Grenfell Tower, his voice steady despite the smoke filling our flats. "I love you," he whispered. Those were his last words. The council called it a tragic accident, but when I found David's final video on his phone recovered weeks later, discovered the truth they desperately wanted buried. What I uncovered about that night didn't just expose criminal neglect, it revealed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local government. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever fought for justice when everyone told you to stay quiet, like this video because this story is for you. David and I met at a community rally in 2013, both of us fighting for better housing conditions in North London. He was speaking passionately about tenants' rights, his dark eyes blazing with conviction. I was drawn to his quiet strength, the way he listened to people's stories without judgment. We were both idealists then, believing we could change the world one conversation at a time. When we married in 2014, we dreamed of starting fresh somewhere we could build a life together. Grenfell Tower seemed like a miracle affordable housing in one of London's most expensive boroughs. The 24-story building had just been selected for refurbishment, and we were told it would become a model of social housing excellence. "Look at this view," David said the day we moved into our 18th floor flat in early 2015, wrapping his arms around me as we stood at the window overlooking London's sprawling cityscape. Our wedding photo from that day still sits on what used to be our kitchen counter, both of us grinning with hope and possibility. David continued his work as a community organizer, helping residents navigate housing benefit applications and challenging unfair evictions. I worked as a social worker, often dealing with families in crisis. We both understood struggle, and we both believed in fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The early days at Grenfell felt like joining a real community. Neighbors knew each other's names, children played in the hallways, and there was genuine warmth among the residents. But even then, small things troubled us. The fire doors didn't close properly. The stairwells smelled of gas on certain floors. Some residents complained about electrical problems that took months to address. David started keeping a notebook of maintenance issues, documenting problems he witnessed throughout the building. "Someone needs to pay attention," he told me one evening, jotting down details about a broken fire exit on the 15th floor. "These aren't small problems, Lynn. These are safety issues." I remember laughing gently at his thoroughness. "You can't save everyone, love." "Maybe not," he replied, "but I can at least keep track of what needs saving." We had plans, so many plans. David wanted to run for the local council, to make real change from within the system. I was considering specializing in family law, helping people navigate custody battles and domestic violence cases. We talked about children, about raising them in our little flat with the big windows and endless London sky. Those dreams feel like someone else's life now, like a story I heard once about two people who believed the world was fundamentally good, who trusted that systems would protect them if they just worked hard enough and cared deeply enough. June 14th started like any other Wednesday. I had a full caseload at the domestic violence shelter where I worked, and David was attending a tenants association meeting about the building's ongoing refurbishment issues. We'd been living with construction noise and dust for over a year, but residents were told the improvements would make Grenfell a showcase of modern social housing. I should have been home by 6 that evening, but Sarah, 23-year-old mother of two, showed up at the shelter with fresh bruises and nowhere to go. Her ex-partner had violated his restraining order again, and she was terrified he'd find her children. I couldn't leave her alone in that state. My work schedule from that day, which I still keep in my purse, shows I was supposed to finish at 5:30 p.m. Instead, I stayed until nearly midnight, helping Sarah navigate emergency housing options and connecting her with legal aid. David texted me around 9, "Working late again. Superwoman. Don't worry about dinner, I'll make something simple." At 11:15, he sent his last text, "Love you, get home safe." Early morning tomorrow. David was always in bed by 10 on weeknights, up at 6 for his morning run around the local park before work. He was methodical about his routines, especially sleep. The fire investigators later determined the blaze started around 12:54 a.m. in a fourth-floor kitchen, caused by a faulty refrigerator that had been reported as malfunctioning weeks earlier. By 1:30 a.m., Flames were racing up the exterior of the building, fueled by the newly installed cladding that was supposed to make Grenfell look more attractive to the wealthy neighbors in the surrounding area. David woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of screaming in the hallways. I was driving home through London's empty streets when the first news alerts started appearing on my phone. Major fire at West London Tower block. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, but I told myself it couldn't be Grenfell. It couldn't be our building. Then I saw the footage on the radio station's live stream, a towering inferno against the night sky, flames consuming floor after floor with terrifying speed. I recognized the shape immediately, the way the building sat against the horizon. I started screaming David's name in my empty car, as if somehow he could hear me through the chaos and flame. Traffic slowed to a crawl as emergency vehicles raced toward North Kensington. I abandoned my car 3 blocks away and ran, pushing through crowds of onlookers and news crews, searching desperately for David. Among the evacuation centers being set up in local churches and community halls, the heat was overwhelming, even from a distance. The entire building was engulfed, flames shooting out of windows like angry fingers reaching toward the sky. I kept thinking about our wedding photo on the kitchen counter, about David's notebook full of maintenance complaints, about all the dreams we'd whispered to each other in that 18th floor flat that was now burning like a torch in the London night. Simone, a police officer, I think, tried to hold me back from getting closer to the building. I fought against his grip, screaming that my husband was inside, that he needed help, that someone had to go get him. The officer's face was kind but grave. "Ma'am, no one can go in there now. The building isn't safe." "It was never safe," I whispered, though I didn't fully understand what I meant yet. The next 72 hours blurred into a nightmare of fluorescent-lit evacuation centers, endless phone calls, and the desperate faces of other families searching for their loved ones. I printed hundreds of missing person posters with David's photo, the one from our wedding day where he's laughing at something I'd whispered in his ear during the ceremony. His warm brown eyes seemed to follow me as I taped his face to every surface I could find. The Westway Sports Center became our unofficial headquarters, filled with families clutching photographs and mobile phones, hoping for news that never came. I met Maria Santos, whose teenage son was missing from the 21st floor. She held his school photo like a talisman, showing it to every official, every volunteer, every journalist who would listen. "He's a good boy," she kept saying in accented English. "He helps with his little sisters. He wouldn't just disappear." There was Ahmed, an elderly man whose daughter and grandchildren lived on the 15th floor. He sat quietly in the corner, prayer beads moving through his weathered fingers, occasionally approaching volunteers to ask if anyone had seen a woman in a red headscarf with 2 small children. His dignity in the face of unimaginable loss humbled me. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Local mosques, churches, and community centers opened their doors. Volunteers arrived with donated clothes, food, and blankets. People offered spare rooms, translation services, and shoulders to cry on. In the midst of official chaos and bureaucratic confusion, ordinary Londoners created a network of support that kept us all functioning. But the authorities seemed unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude. Information was scarce and often contradictory. Hospital lists were incomplete. Evacuation records didn't exist. No one seemed to know who had made it out and who was still missing. We were told to call various hotlines, but the numbers were constantly busy or provided no useful information. I spent the first night calling every hospital in London, describing David over and over. 36 years old, about 6 feet tall, dark hair, brown eyes, possibly injured in the Grenfell Tower fire. "I'm sorry," came the repeated response. "We have no record of that name." Each rejection felt like a small death. By the second day, the full horror was becoming clear. The fire had consumed the building so completely that identification of remains would take weeks or months. Families were asked to provide DNA samples and dental records. The clinical nature of these requests, reducing our loved ones to biological markers, felt dehumanizing and surreal. I kept thinking about David's morning routine, his careful attention to dental hygiene, the way he flossed religiously every night before bed. Such mundane details suddenly carried the weight of potential identification. These small intimacies of daily life had become evidence in a disaster that shouldn't have happened. The media attention was intense, but often insensitive. Reporters thrust microphones in our faces, asking how we felt, wanting us to perform our grief for television audiences. Some families spoke out, desperate to keep their loved ones' names in the public consciousness. Others, like Ahmed, maintained their privacy with quiet dignity. I found myself somewhere in between, giving occasional interviews but always returning to the same message. David was more than a victim. He was a community organizer, a man who cared about social justice, someone who had documented building safety concerns because he believed in protecting his neighbors. His death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a failure of systems that were supposed to keep people safe. On the third day, a volunteer approached me with gentle eyes and a clipboard. "Mrs. Blackburn," she said softly, "the police would like to speak with you about providing additional information for identification purposes." The careful way she spoke told me what I'd been trying not to accept. David wasn't coming home. 3 weeks after the fire, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen called me with news I'd been dreading and desperately hoping for. "Mrs. Blackburn, we've made a positive identification using dental records. I'm very sorry for your loss." David's body was recovered from the 18th floor, near what had been our bedroom. The inspector's voice was professionally compassionate as she explained that he likely died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached him. He wouldn't have suffered, she assured me, though I wondered how anyone could know such things with certainty. The formal identification process was clinical and surreal. Forms to sign, arrangements to make, decisions about burial or cremation, when all I wanted was to hide under our duvet and pretend none of this was real. My sister Claire flew in from Edinburgh, taking charge of logistics while I moved through the days like a sleepwalker. It was Claire who answered the phone when Di Chen called again 2 weeks later. "They've found David's mobile phone," she told me gently. "It's water damaged from the firefighting efforts, but they think some of the data might be recoverable. They'd like your permission to examine it." The phone had been found in the debris near David's body, somehow protected by a fallen beam that created a small pocket of space. The forensics team managed to extract some data, though many files were corrupted. When they handed me the device, sealed in an evidence bag, it felt like holding a piece of David's final hours. For days, I couldn't bring myself to look at what they'd recovered. The phone sat on my kitchen table, my temporary kitchen table in the small flat Claire had rented for me while I figured out what came next. I'd lost everything. Our home, our belongings, our shared life, but somehow, the thought of seeing David's final moments felt more frightening than losing everything else. "You don't have to do this alone," Claire said one evening, finding me staring at the evidence bag. "Whatever's on there, we'll face it together." The police technician had explained that David had taken several photos and videos during the fire, along with voice notes. "Your husband seemed to be documenting what was happening," Di Chen had told me. "It might be difficult to watch, but it could also be important evidence." When I finally opened the files, my hand shaking as I navigated the damaged phone's interface, the first thing I saw was a photo David had taken of our wedding picture, still sitting on the kitchen counter despite the smoke filling our flat. He'd photographed it like he was saying goodbye. Then came the video shaky footage of smoke-filled hallways, blocked stairwells, and David's calm voice narrating what he was seeing. His voice was steady, purposeful, like he was giving testimony for some future reckoning. "The fire exit on this floor is blocked by storage," he said in one video. "The fire doors aren't closing properly. They haven't worked since the refurbishment started." In another video, taken from our 18th floor stairwell, David documented residents being told by emergency services to return to their flats and wait for rescue. "They're telling people to stay put," his voice narrated, "but the smoke is getting worse. The stay put policy isn't working." The final video was the hardest to watch. David had returned to our flat after attempting to evacuate, apparently following official advice to shelter in place. The footage showed him barricading our door with wet towels, opening windows, and trying to create a safe space to wait for rescue. His voice was growing hoarse from smoke inhalation, but he continued documenting what he observed. "The cladding outside is burning like paper. This wasn't supposed to happen. Someone needs to know this wasn't just an accident." At the very end, barely audible through the static and smoke damage, I heard him say my name. "Lindy, if you're watching this, know that I love you. Don't let them say this was just bad luck. Don't let them forget." I understood then that David hadn't been taking those videos for himself. He'd been creating evidence, even as he faced his own death. My husband, the community organizer, had spent his final hour trying to protect other people by documenting the truth. David's video testimony became my roadmap to understanding what really happened that night. Over the following weeks, I watched each clip dozens of times, analyzing every detail, every word he'd spoken into the smoke-filled darkness of our dying building. The footage was methodical, almost journalistic in its approach. David had moved through the building systematically, documenting safety failures with the calm precision of someone who understood he was creating evidence for posterity. In one video, filmed in the 14th floor stairwell, he showed how the fire doors had been propped open with wooden wedges, completely defeating their purpose of containing smoke and flames. These doors are supposed to be self-closing, David's voice explained in the video, his phone's flashlight illuminating the wedges. They've been like this since the refurbishment started. I've reported this 3 times to the building management, but nothing's been done. Another video, taken near the building's main stairwell, showed residents trying to evacuate through passages blocked by construction materials. David's camera captured elderly residents and families with small children, being forced to turn back, returning to their flats because the exits were impassable. His voice remained steady as he narrated. The fire escape routes are blocked on multiple floors. People can't get out. The most damning footage showed the building's fire safety systems failing catastrophically. David had documented alarm systems that weren't working, emergency lighting that had failed, and sprinkler systems that never activated. There's no water pressure, he reported in one clip, showing a sprinkler head that dripped rather than sprayed. The fire suppression system isn't working. But it was David's documentation of the stay put advice that truly revealed the scope of the disaster. Multiple videos showed residents being told by emergency responders to return to their flats and wait for rescue, despite the obvious failure of the building's fire safety measures. The stay put policy was designed for buildings with proper fire compartmentation, buildings where fires could be contained to single flats, while residents in other units remained safely in place. Grenfell Tower, as David's videos clearly showed, was not such a building. The fire was spreading rapidly through the exterior cladding, turning the entire structure into a vertical furnace, yet residents were still being advised to shelter in place, waiting for rescues that couldn't come fast enough. They're telling Mrs. Ahmed on the 15th floor to stay in her flat with her grandchildren, David reported in one video, his voice tight with growing alarm. But the smoke is coming through the walls. The fire's in the building's fabric now. The compartmentation has failed. The technical precision of David's observations struck me. He understood building safety systems from his work with tenants' rights organizations. He knew what should have been working and could clearly articulate why it wasn't. His final videos weren't just the desperate recordings of a dying man. They were expert testimony about systemic failures that had turned a survivable fire into a mass casualty event. In his last clear video, taken from our 18th floor window, David had turned the camera outward to document the building's exterior cladding burning like a fuse. "The whole building is on fire," he said, his voice finally showing strain. "This cladding was supposed to be safe. Someone approved this. Someone said this was okay." The video ended abruptly, but his message was clear. This wasn't an accident or an act of God. This was the predictable result of decisions made by people who prioritized cost savings over human life. David had spent his final hour not just trying to survive, but ensuring that someone would understand why he and 71 other people were dying in a building that should have kept them safe. Watching those videos changed something fundamental in me. Grief began transforming into something sharper, more focused. David hadn't just died, he'd been killed by negligence, by cost-cutting, by a system that treated working-class lives as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of efficiency and profit. His calm, methodical documentation of these failures became my call to action. David had created a roadmap for understanding not just what went wrong, but who was responsible for making it go wrong. Now it was up to me to make sure someone listened. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea's initial press statement, released just hours after the fire was extinguished, painted a picture of tragic inevitability. I kept that document, printed from the council's website, as a reminder of how quickly institutions move to protect themselves from accountability. The tragic fire at Grenfell Tower appears to have been caused by an electrical appliance malfunction, the statement read. While the loss of life is devastating, initial investigations suggest this was an unfortunate accident that could not have been reasonably prevented. The council expresses its deepest sympathies to all affected families. Could not have been reasonably prevented. Those words haunted me as I compared the council's narrative with what David had actually witnessed and documented. The official story was one of inevitable tragedy: a faulty refrigerator, an old building, the unfortunate alignment of circumstances that sometimes leads to disaster. David's videos told a completely different story. I began reaching out to other bereaved families, sharing what David had recorded and asking if they had similar evidence. Maria Santos, whose son Carlos had died on the 21st floor, broke down when I showed her David's footage of the blocked fire exits. Carlos called me, she said through tears. He said the stairwell was full of smoke and he couldn't get down. They told him to go back to his flat and wait. Why would they tell him that if the exits were blocked? Ahmed Mohammed, the elderly man I'd met at the evacuation center, nodded grimly when David's videos showed the failed sprinkler systems. My daughter Fatima sent me messages, he said, showing me his phone. She said there was no water, that the taps weren't working. She was trying to wet towels to block the smoke, but there was no water pressure. We discovered that nearly every family had similar stories of violence that directly contradicted the council's narrative of an unpreventable accident. Residents had been documenting safety problems for months before the fire. Complaints about faulty fire doors, broken emergency lighting, and blocked evacuation routes had been submitted repeatedly to the tenant management organization that ran the building on behalf of the council. One submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for all correspondence between residents and building management regarding safety concerns. The response, when it finally came 6 weeks later, was heavily redacted but still revealing. Page after page of complaints, all dismissed with variations of "thank you for your concern. The matter will be investigated," or "the building meets all current safety requirements." David's own maintenance requests were in those files: formal complaints about fire doors that wouldn't close, emergency lighting that didn't work, and concerns about the new cladding installation. His final complaint, submitted just 3 weeks before the fire, was particularly prescient. The new external cladding appears to be highly flammable. During a small controlled test with a lighter, a sample piece ignited immediately and burned rapidly. This seems inconsistent with fire safety requirements for high-rise residential buildings. The council's response to David's cladding concerns was a single line: the materials used in the refurbishment meet all applicable building regulations and have been approved by qualified professionals. But David's technical concerns were proving accurate. Independent fire safety experts were beginning to speak publicly about the cladding system installed at Grenfell. Dr. Barbara Lane, a forensic fire engineer, published a preliminary report that confirmed what David had observed. The aluminum composite cladding panels had a polyethylene core that was essentially plastic. When exposed to heat, the panels had acted like solid fuel, turning the building's exterior into a massive accelerant. The gap between the council's official narrative and the emerging technical evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't a tragic accident, it was the predictable result of using inappropriate materials in a high-rise residential building. Someone had chosen to install cladding that they knew, or should have known, would turn the building into a fire trap. I began attending the weekly meetings of bereaved families and survivors. Our informal group was growing into something more organized, more determined. We called ourselves Grenfell United, and our message was simple: this fire was preventable. The deaths were avoidable, and someone needed to be held accountable. The more we learned, the angrier we became. Not the wild, unfocused anger of early grief, but the cold, determined fury that comes from understanding you've been lied to by people whose job was to protect you. We had David's videos, residents' complaint letters, and growing expert testimony that the fire was entirely preventable. The council had their carefully crafted press statements and legal teams. It was becoming clear that the fight for truth was just beginning. David's maintenance request from March 2016 became the key that unlocked a deeper understanding of how systemic the negligence had been. The document, which I found in the council's heavily redacted Freedom of Information response, was written in David's careful handwriting on official tenant management organization forms. "Fire doors on 18th floor landing do not close automatically," he had written. "Door closer mechanisms appear to be damaged or disconnected. This creates a serious fire safety risk as smoke and flames could spread rapidly between flats and stairwells. Request immediate inspection and repair." Below David's complaint, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Resident concern noted. Doors meet minimum requirements. No action required at this time. The form was signed by Trevor Matthews, building safety officer, and dated 2 weeks after David's original complaint. I stared at that signature for a long time. Trevor Matthews, a man paid to keep residents safe, had dismissed David's life-saving observation with a bureaucratic shrug. The minimum requirements he referenced were clearly inadequate if they allowed fire doors to remain permanently open during a building fire. This pattern repeated throughout the FOI documents. Residents had submitted dozens of safety complaints over the years leading up to the fire, and almost all had been dismissed with similar, bureaucratic language. Mrs. Chen from the 14th floor had reported sparking electrical outlets. Building electrics meet current standards. Mr. Okafor from the 9th floor had complained about gas smells in the stairwells. No gas leaks detected during routine inspection. The most disturbing discovery was a complaint filed by Janet Morrison, a retired fire safety officer who lived on the 6th floor. Morrison had submitted a detailed technical report about the building's evacuation procedures, highlighting that the single stairwell design made the building unsuitable for a stay-put evacuation policy if fire spread beyond a single flat. In the event of a building-wide fire, Morrison had written, residents will be unable to evacuate safely through a single stairwell. The building's design requires a simultaneous evacuation policy with multiple protected escape routes. Current policy will result in casualties if a major fire occurs. The TMO's response to Morrison's expert warning was dismissive. Evacuation procedures follow current London Fire Brigade guidelines and are appropriate for this building type. Resident concerns have been noted, but no policy changes are required. Morrison died in the fire, along with her husband and adult son. Her professional expertise about fire safety had been ignored by the very people responsible for keeping her safe. I began mapping out the web of complaints and dismissals, creating a timeline that showed how many opportunities there had been to prevent the disaster. Between 2015 and 2017, residents had identified virtually every safety failure that would contribute to the fire's deadly spread: faulty fire doors, inadequate evacuation routes, electrical problems, gas leaks, and concerns about the new cladding materials. Each complaint had been dismissed or minimally addressed. Each warning had been ignored. The paper trail revealed a systematic pattern of prioritizing cost savings over resident safety, bureaucratic convenience over life-threatening concerns. Legal advice came from Imran Khan, a human rights lawyer who specialized in cases involving corporate accountability. Khan reviewed the FOI documents and David's videos with growing amazement. "This is extraordinary evidence," he told me during our first meeting. "Your husband essentially documented a crime in progress. Combined with the paper trail of ignored warnings, this suggests gross negligence at minimum, possibly criminal negligence." Khan explained that proving criminal negligence required demonstrating that officials knew their actions created serious risk of death and proceeded anyway. "The challenge isn't proving negligence," he said. "The challenge is proving they knew the consequences of their negligence." These documents suggest they did know. They had multiple warnings from residents about life-threatening safety failures, and they chose to ignore them. The legal framework was complex, but the moral framework was simple. People in positions of authority had received clear warnings about deadly safety failures and had chosen not to act. Their inaction had killed David and 71 other people. I submitted additional FOI requests, seeking correspondence between the TMO, the council, and the companies involved in the refurbishment. The responses revealed a disturbing pattern of cost-cutting and corner-cutting throughout the project. Original specifications for fire-resistant cladding had been changed to cheaper, more flammable materials. Fire safety consultations had been abbreviated or skipped entirely. Resident safety concerns had been systematically dismissed. David's notebook, which I'd retrieved from our destroyed flat, contained observations that now seemed prophetic. Building management seems more concerned with appearance than safety. He had written after a residents' meeting about the refurbishment. "They keep talking about making the building look better for the neighborhood, but they won't discuss why they've downgraded fire safety materials." The paper trail was painting a clear picture. Grenfell Tower had been turned into a death trap through a series of deliberate decisions prioritizing cost and appearance over resident safety. David and the other victims hadn't died in a tragic accident. They'd been killed by a system that treated their lives as acceptable losses in the pursuit of cheaper construction and prettier facades. The architectural plans that changed everything arrived in a manila envelope marked confidential legal privilege. My lawyer, Imran Khan, had obtained them through legal discovery processes that I didn't fully understand but deeply appreciated. When I spread the documents across my kitchen table, I was looking at the blueprint of a preventable massacre. The original specifications from 2014 called for fire-resistant zinc cladding panels with mineral wool insulation materials that would have contained any external fire and prevented it from spreading up the building's facade. The revised specifications from late 2015 showed a completely different system: aluminum composite panels with polyethylene cores and combustible insulation materials. The cost difference was stark. The original fire-resistant system was quoted at £3.2 million. The revised system that was actually installed cost £2.6 million, a savings of £600,000 that would ultimately cost 72 lives. Email chains between Ridden Construction, the main contractor, and the tenant management organization revealed how the deadly substitution had been made. A project manager named Stephen Blake had written to TMO officials in October 2015, "We can achieve significant cost savings by switching to the ACM panels with Paycore. This system meets building regulations and will provide the aesthetic improvement you're seeking." The response from Robert Black, the TMO's operations director, was chilling in its casual acceptance. "Cost savings are essential for this project. Please proceed with the revised specifications provided they meet minimum regulatory requirements." Dr. Barbara Lane's forensic analysis, which had been completed by this point, made clear that meeting minimum regulatory requirements was entirely insufficient for a high-rise residential building. The regulations themselves were flawed, allowing materials that created obvious fire risks when used in specific configurations. But the emails revealed that even those inadequate regulations had been misinterpreted or ignored. A building control officer named Marcus Williams had raised concerns about the cladding system in December 2015, writing, "The proposed ACM system may not provide adequate fire resistance for a building of this height and occupancy type. Recommend fire engineering assessment before proceeding." Williams' concerns had been overruled by his supervisor, who noted in the margin, "Client is pressing for completion. Standard testing should be sufficient." There was no evidence that any fire engineering assessment had ever been completed. Most damning document was a cost-benefit analysis prepared by Ridden Construction that explicitly acknowledged the fire risks of the cheaper cladding system. The analysis noted that the ACM panels may present increased fire risk compared to mineral alternatives, but concluded that regulatory compliance and cost savings justify selection of this system. They knew, the contractors knew, the cheaper materials created fire risks, and they installed them anyway because they met minimum regulatory standards and saved money. The TMO knew their residents had concerns about building safety, and they dismissed those concerns to keep the project on budget. Building control officers knew the cladding system might be inadequate, and they approved it anyway to avoid project delays. I found myself staring at a photograph included in the planning documents, an artist's rendering of how Grenfell Tower would look after refurbishment. The building was depicted in gleaming aluminum and glass, a modern facade that would make it blend in with the expensive developments surrounding it in North Kensington. The image was titled "Vision for Enhanced Community Asset." Enhanced Community Asset. They had turned our home into a facade improvement project, prioritizing how the building looked to wealthy neighbors over how safely it protected the working-class families who actually lived there. The refurbishment had never been about improving conditions for residents. It had been about improving appearances for everyone else. Expert testimony from Professor Niev Inisidadid, a fire forensics specialist, explained how the cladding system had turned Grenfell into what she called a vertical accelerant. The aluminum panels with polyethylene core had created a gap behind the cladding where fire could travel rapidly up the building's exterior. The insulation material was essentially expanded plastic that burned readily and released toxic gases. This system was designed for aesthetic appeal, not fire safety. Professor Nisi Dayad testified to the inquiry. The materials chosen would spread fire rapidly up a building facade, creating exactly the scenario we witnessed at Grenfell Tower. The gap between the original safe design and the final deadly design represented more than cost savings. It represented a fundamental disregard for the lives of the people who would live in the building. Every decision to cut costs had cut safety. Every choice to prioritize appearance had deprioritized survival. David's final video from our 18th floor window, showing the building's exterior burning like paper, had captured the visual evidence of these deadly design choices. The cladding that was supposed to make our building beautiful had turned it into a torch that burned so brightly it could be seen from space. The refurbishment scandal revealed the brutal mathematics of inequality. £600,000 in cost savings had been worth more than the lives of the primarily immigrant and elderly residents of Grenfell Tower. The aesthetic preferences of wealthy neighbors had been prioritized over the survival of the people who actually lived in the building. Looking at those architectural plans, I understood that David and the others hadn't died in an accident or even through simple negligence. They had been killed by a system that calculated their lives were worth less than the cost of proper fire safety materials. The Grenfell Tower Residents WhatsApp group had been created in early 2017 as a way for neighbors to share information about the ongoing refurbishment work. What began as coordination about parking restrictions and noise complaints became, in the early hours of June 14th, a real-time record of people dying while seeking help that never came. Zainabdeen, who survived the fire from the 14th floor, shared the group's message history with our growing coalition of bereaved families. Reading those messages was like watching the disaster unfold through the eyes of people who trusted their building to keep them safe. The first fire-related message came at 1:26 a.m. from Motukyu on the 4th floor. Anyone else smell smoke? Think there might be a small fire somewhere. By 1:45 a.m., the messages revealed growing panic. Fire in the building. Everyone get out now. And stairwell full of smoke on floors 6 to 10. Can't get down. But it was the messages from residents following official advice that broke my heart. At 2:15 a.m., Jessica Urbano posted, "Fire brigade told us to stay in our flat on 20th floor and wait for help. Putting towels under door. Pray for us." Jessica died waiting for help that couldn't reach her. The messages revealed the deadly confusion caused by the stay put policy being applied to a building where fire compartmentation had failed. Residents on different floors were receiving contradictory advice, some told to evacuate immediately, others told to remain in their flats. The building's single stairwell made evacuation impossible once it filled with smoke. But emergency services continued advising residents to shelter in place even as the building's safety systems collapsed around them. At 2:47 a.m., Berkty Haff from the 18th floor posted David Blackburn documenting everything with his phone. "Smart man. Someone needs to record what's happening here." Seeing David's name in those messages, knowing that other residents had noticed his efforts to document the disaster, gave me a strange sense of pride mixed with unbearable sadness. Even as he faced death, David had been thinking about creating evidence for the living. The final messages in the group chat painted a horrific picture of people trapped in a building that had become uninhabitable. No water pressure anywhere. Post head Yahya Hashim from the 15th floor at 3:12 a.m. Can't wet towels or cloths. Smoke getting worse. Mary Mendy, who lived on the 19th floor with her young daughter, sent a voice message at 3:28 a.m. that I could barely stand to hear. "The fire is outside our window now. My baby is coughing so much. If we don't make it, tell my family we love them." Mary and her daughter didn't make it. Survivors shared similar stories when we began meeting regularly at local community centers. Dennis Murphy, who escaped from the 11th floor, described encountering families with young children being told to return to their flats because the stairwell was too dangerous. "I saw this woman with a baby," he told us, his voice shaking. "She was trying to get down the stairs, but a firefighter told her to go back up and wait in her flat. I never saw her again." Natasha Elcock, who lived on the 7th floor and managed to evacuate early, had been one of the few residents to ignore the stay-put advice. "I grabbed my children and ran as soon as I smelled smoke," she said. "People called me crazy for panicking over a small fire. I kept thinking I was overreacting, but something felt wrong about staying in the building." Her instincts had saved her family's life. The survivor testimonies revealed a pattern of residents being better informed about the building's safety problems than the officials meant to protect them. Many had noticed the new cladding panels felt thin and flimsy compared to the original exterior. Some had observed that the building seemed to echo sounds differently after the refurbishment, suggesting changes in the structure that affected fire compartment ATION. Kareem Masilihi, whose uncle died on the 14th floor, had been documenting building safety concerns on his blog for months before the fire. "The TMO kept telling us the building was safer after the refurbishment," he said, "but residents could see that corners were being cut. We weren't qualified fire safety experts, but we lived in the building. We knew something was wrong." The most heartbreaking testimonies came from residents who had tried to help their neighbors during the fire. Steve Power, from the 15th floor, described carrying elderly residents down smoke-filled stairs, only to encounter blocked exits and have to return them to their flats. "We were trying to save people," he said, "but the building was designed to trap us." Antonio Roncolato, who lived on the 10th floor, had attempted to reach his friend Khadija Say on the 20th floor after receiving her desperate phone calls. "She was an artist, full of life," he said. "She kept calling, saying the smoke was getting worse, asking when help would come. I tried to climb up the stairs to get her, but I couldn't breathe. I had to turn back." Khadija died in her flat, still waiting for rescue. These voices from the tower revealed that the official narrative of an unforeseeable tragedy was completely false. Residents had predicted safety problems, documented them, and reported them repeatedly. They had been better informed about the building's vulnerabilities than the officials responsible for protecting them. But in a system that prioritized cost, savings over safety, and official procedures over resident expertise, their voices had been systematically ignored. The WhatsApp messages and survivor testimonies created an undeniable record. The people who lived in Grenfell Tower had known it was dangerous, and they had died because no one with power had listened to them. The letter from Kingsley Napoli LLP arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 2017, 4 months after the fire. The thick cream envelope looked official and expensive, the kind of correspondence that immediately signals serious legal consequences. Inside, 12 pages of dense legal language essentially threatened to destroy me financially if I continued speaking publicly about what David had documented. "Our clients are concerned about the defamatory nature of statements made by Mrs. Blackburn regarding the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project," the letter began. "Unless these statements cease immediately, our clients will be forced to pursue legal remedies, including claims for damages and injunctive relief." The clients weren't named directly, but the law firm represented several companies involved in the refurbishment: Ridden Construction, Celotex, the insulation manufacturer, and Arconic, the cladding supplier. Their message was clear: stop talking about criminal negligence or face financial ruin. I called Imran Khan immediately, reading the letter aloud with shaking hands. "This is standard intimidation," he said calmly. "They're trying to silence you before criminal proceedings can begin. The fact that they're this worried about your evidence suggests we're on the right track." Khan explained that the corporate lawyers were using defamation law as a weapon against grieving families who couldn't afford lengthy legal battles. "They know you're not wealthy," he said. "They're counting on financial pressure to force you into silence. But we have something they don't: the truth, documented in your husband's videos and supported by expert testimony." The intimidation campaign wasn't limited to legal threats. Within days of the law firm's letter, I began receiving anonymous phone calls at odd hours. The callers never spoke, just breathing into the phone before hanging up. My social media accounts were flooded with hostile messages questioning my motives and accusing me of exploiting David's death for attention. More disturbing were the attempts to discredit David's evidence. Online forums began spreading rumors that David's videos had been fabricated or manipulated. Someone created fake social media profiles claiming to be Grenfell residents who disputed the survivor testimonies. The disinformation campaign was sophisticated and well-funded, clearly designed to muddy the waters around our evidence. But the intimidation had an unintended effect. It brought the bereaved families closer together and attracted media attention to our cause. When news outlets reported on the corporate legal threats against grieving families, public opinion began shifting strongly in our favor. The contrast between wealthy corporations using legal intimidation and working-class families seeking justice for their dead relatives created a powerful narrative that resonated across British society. We formalized our organization as Grenfell, United, with legal structure and dedicated advocacy goals. Our first public demonstration outside the Royal Courts of Justice drew hundreds of supporters carrying photos of the 72 people who died in the fire. David's image was among them, his warm smile from our wedding photo transformed into a symbol of the fight for accountability. My first speech to the media was terrifying and cathartic. Standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by other bereaved families, I read from David's maintenance request about fire door failures. "My husband died trying to document the truth about what killed him," I said, my voice carrying across the crowd. "These legal threats won't silence that truth." The legal strategy Khan developed was ambitious: Rather than waiting for official inquiries or regulatory action, we would pursue criminal complaints directly through private prosecution if necessary. The evidence your husband documented, combined with the paper trail of ignored warnings, meets the threshold for corporate manslaughter charges, he explained. We're going to force the authorities to take this seriously. Within weeks, our legal action attracted pro bono support from barristers specializing in human rights and corporate accountability. The legal team grew to include experts in building regulations, fire safety engineering, and corporate criminal law. What had started as one grieving widow seeking answers was becoming a comprehensive legal challenge to an entire system of corporate impunity. The breakthrough came when Khan obtained additional internal documents through legal discovery. Email chains between executives revealed that senior management at multiple companies had been aware of fire safety concerns but had proceeded with the deadly cladding system anyway. One email from a Celotex marketing manager was particularly damning. We know the insulation doesn't meet the fire performance standards for high-rise residential use, but the building regulations don't explicitly prohibit it. Another document showed Arconic executives discussing the flammability of their cladding panels in residential applications. The PACOR creates significant fire risk in high-rise buildings, noted a technical report from 2014. This product should not be used in residential towers above 6 stories, yet they had sold those panels specifically for use at Grenfell Tower, a 24-story residential building. The corporate legal threats continued, but they were becoming counterproductive. Each new intimidation attempt generated more media coverage and public sympathy for our cause. The wealthy corporations trying to silence grieving families had badly miscalculated the public mood. British society was increasingly angry about inequality and corporate impunity, and our fight symbolized broader frustrations about power and accountability. But by December 2017, we had assembled a legal case that Khan described as the strongest evidence of corporate criminal liability I've seen in 20 years of practice. David's videos, the paper trail of ignored warnings, and the internal corporate documents created an undeniable picture of gross negligence that had caused preventable deaths. The legal battle was just beginning, but we had already won something important: the right to be heard, and the evidence to demand accountability from people who thought they were above the law. The internal email from Robert Black, the TMO's operations director, arrived through a whistleblower who contacted us in January 2018. The subject line read, "Managing the Narrative Grenfell Response Strategy," and the contents revealed a coordinated campaign to minimize criminal responsibility that went far beyond what any of us had imagined. Our primary objective must be controlling public perception of the incident. Black had written to senior council officials and corporate partners 3 days after the fire. While tragic, this event must be framed as an unforeseeable accident, rather than a failure of our management systems. Legal liability exposure requires careful messaging coordination between all parties. The email outlined a comprehensive strategy to deflect accountability, blame the original building design rather than the refurbishment choices, emphasize regulatory compliance rather than safety outcomes, and characterize resident complaints as hindsight bias rather than ignored warnings. Most chillingly, it recommended limiting media access to family members who may make inflammatory statements based on grief rather than facts. They had been planning to silence us before we even knew we had voices. The document revealed coordination between the TMO Kensington and Chelsea Council and the companies involved in the refurbishment. Legal teams were sharing strategies, public relations firms were crafting unified messaging, and political contacts were being activated to limit the scope of official investigations. A follow-up email from Councillor Nicholas Paget Brown showed the political dimension of the cover-up. Westminster contacts confirmed that public inquiry scope can be limited to technical building matters rather than broader policy failures. This approach minimizes political liability while appearing responsive to public concerns. The coordination was sophisticated and well-funded. We discovered that the council had hired Portland Communications, a crisis management firm specializing in protecting corporate clients from accountability after disasters. Internal documents showed Portland developing strategies to reframe the narrative from criminal negligence to regulatory gaps and redirect public anger toward abstract policy failures rather than individual accountability. Media manipulation was central to their strategy. Friendly journalists were briefed with talking points emphasizing the complexity of building regulations and the difficulty of preventing freak accidents. Critical coverage was met with aggressive legal challenges and threatened advertising boycotts. Social media campaigns spread doubt about survivor testimonies and expert analysis. The most disturbing discovery was evidence of surveillance and harassment directed at bereaved families and survivors. Private investigators had been hired to research our backgrounds, looking for information that could be used to discredit our testimonies. Phone records showed extensive monitoring of our communications with journalists and lawyers. My own phone had been targeted. Technical analysis revealed spyware that could access messages, calls, and location data. The violation felt as profound as the original loss. Not only had they killed David, but they were now invading the privacy of my grief and advocacy. The harassment escalated as our legal case gained strength. Anonymous messages appeared on social media accusing me of profiting from David's death. Fake websites were created spreading conspiracy theories about the fire. Someone sent threatening letters to my temporary address, forcing me to change locations repeatedly. But the intimidation campaign began backfiring spectacularly when investigative journalists started exposing the coordination. The Guardian published leaked emails showing the extent of the cover-up efforts. Channel 4 News obtained recordings of Portland Communications strategy sessions. The BBC documented the surveillance activities targeting bereaved families. Public outrage was immediate and intense. The contrast between grieving families seeking justice and wealthy institutions orchestrating cover-ups created a powerful moral clarity that resonated across political divides. Conservative MPs began distancing themselves from the council's actions. Opposition leaders demanded criminal investigations of the cover-up itself. My testimony to Parliament's Communities and Local Government Committee became a turning point. Sitting in the wood-paneled committee room, facing MPs who controlled the levers of power, I read directly from David's final video. Someone needs to know this wasn't just an accident. Don't let them forget. Honorable members, I continued, my husband spent his final hour creating evidence of criminal negligence because he believed someone with authority would listen. Instead, the people responsible for his death spent the months after the fire coordinating strategies to avoid accountability. This committee has the power to ensure David's sacrifice wasn't meaningless. The committee's questioning was intense, but sympathetic. Conservative MP Bob Neal pressed me on the evidence of coordination. Mrs. Blackburn, are you alleging that senior officials actively conspired to avoid criminal liability? I'm not alleging anything, Mr. Neal, I replied. I'm presenting documentary evidence of exactly that conspiracy. The emails speak for themselves. Labour MP Helen Hayes asked about the surveillance. How does it feel to discover your privacy was violated while you were grieving your husband's death? It feels like being victimized twice, I answered. First, they killed David through negligence. Then they tried to destroy me for seeking justice. But they underestimated how strong grief can make you when it's focused on truth. The media coverage of my testimony was extensive and supportive. Editorial pages across the political spectrum condemned the surveillance and harassment of bereaved families. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for criminal prosecutions of both the original negligence and the subsequent cover-up. More importantly, the parliamentary testimony triggered a Metropolitan Police investigation into potential criminal conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. The same surveillance tactics used against us were now being applied to the people who had orchestrated them. The machine they had built to protect themselves from accountability was beginning to work against them. Every document they had created to coordinate their defense became evidence of criminal conspiracy. Every strategy session they had recorded became proof of intent to obstruct justice. Fighting the machine had seemed impossible when it was just grieving families against wealthy corporations and government institutions. But the machine's own documentation of its crimes had given us the weapons to destroy it. David's videos had provided the evidence of the original negligence. Their emails had provided the evidence of criminal conspiracy to cover it up. The cover-up had become bigger than the crime, and both were about to face the full force of criminal law. Dr. Barbara Lane's independent forensic fire report arrived on my doorstep on a cold February morning in 2018, 8 months after David's death. The 247-page document represented 18 months of painstaking scientific analysis, and its conclusions would finally give legal weight to everything David had witnessed and documented during his final hour. The fire at Grenfell Tower was entirely preventable. Dr. Lane's executive summary began. The loss of life resulted from a series of deliberate design choices that prioritized cost savings and aesthetic appearance over basic fire safety principles. Had appropriate materials been used, this fire would have been contained to the flat of origin. The technical analysis was devastating in its precision. Dr. Lane had recreated the fire's progression using advanced computer modeling, demonstrating exactly how the ACM cladding panels with polyethylene cores had created a chimney effect that accelerated flames up the building's exterior. The report included thermal imaging that showed how proper fire-resistant materials would have prevented the blaze from spreading beyond the fourth floor. Most importantly for our legal case, Dr. Lane's analysis validated every technical observation David had made in his videos. The blocked fire exits, the failed compartmentation, the inadequate water pressure, the malfunctioning fire doors were identified as contributing factors that turned a containable fire into a mass casualty event. Mr. Blackburn's documentation represents some of the most accurate real-time fire safety analysis I have encountered. Dr. Lane noted in a section specifically addressing David's videos, his observations about system failures and evacuation obstacles are technically sound and provide crucial evidence about the sequence of events that led to multiple fatalities. The report's conclusions were unambiguous. The fire was not an accident, not an unforeseeable tragedy, not an inevitable result of an aging building. It was the predictable outcome of using inappropriate materials and ignoring basic fire safety principles in a high-rise residential building. Within days of receiving Dr. Lane's report, our legal team filed formal complaints with the Metropolitan Police requesting criminal charges of corporate manslaughter against multiple defendants, Ridden Construction, Celotex, Arconic, the TM, and senior council officials. The scientific evidence gave prosecutors everything they needed to pursue the most serious charges possible. Detective Chief Inspector Matt Bonner, who had been assigned to lead the criminal investigation, called me personally to discuss next steps. Mrs. Blackburn, he said, Dr. Lane's report, combined with your husband's video evidence and the internal documents your legal team has provided, gives us the strongest corporate manslaughter case I've seen in my career. We're opening a full criminal investigation. The announcement of criminal proceedings triggered immediate changes in public discourse about Grenfell. Media coverage shifted from discussing tragic accidents and regulatory gaps to examining criminal negligence and corporate liability. The companies that had been threatening legal action against bereaved families suddenly found themselves facing potential prison sentences for their executives. My first public statement after the criminal investigation was announced felt like a vindication of everything David had tried to achieve in his final hour. Standing outside New Scotland Yard, surrounded by other bereaved families and survivors, I read from Dr. Lane's conclusions. Science has proven what residents always knew: this fire was preventable. David died documenting evidence of criminal negligence, and now that evidence will be tested in criminal court. The response from corporate defendants was swift and predictable. Expensive legal teams immediately began filing motions to limit the scope of criminal proceedings, arguing that building regulations compliance should provide immunity from criminal liability. Public relations firms launched campaigns emphasizing the complexity of building safety and the difficulty of assigning individual responsibility in large construction projects. But the strength of our evidence made their defensive strategies increasingly desperate. Dr. Lane's scientific analysis was unassailable. David's video documentation was authentic and technically accurate. The internal corporate documents revealed clear knowledge of safety risks. The paper trail of ignored resident warnings demonstrated gross negligence that had caused foreseeable deaths. Corporate executives who had spent months avoiding public accountability were now facing personal criminal liability. Board meetings were being recorded by investigators. Email communications were being preserved as evidence. The same surveillance techniques that had been used against bereaved families were now being applied to the people responsible for the fire. The investigation's scope expanded rapidly as evidence revealed the extent of criminal conspiracy. The cover-up efforts, documented in leaked emails, constituted separate criminal offenses of perverting the course of justice. The surveillance and harassment of bereaved families violated multiple privacy and intimidation laws. What had begun as a corporate manslaughter investigation was becoming a comprehensive criminal case against institutional corruption. International attention focused on the Grenfell investigation as a test case for corporate accountability in the global construction industry. Similar cladding systems had been installed on buildings worldwide, often with the same cost-cutting priorities that had proved deadly at Grenfell. Our case was being watched by regulators and prosecutors from Australia to Canada, all grappling with how to hold multinational corporations responsible for safety failures. The breakthrough had taken 8 months of relentless advocacy, legal pressure, and public campaigning. But David's final act of documentation was finally receiving the serious investigation it deserved. His videos, dismissed initially as the desperate recordings of a dying man, were now recognized as expert testimony about criminal negligence that would be tested in Britain's highest courts. Dr. Lane's scientific validation of David's observations felt like a conversation across the divide between life and death. My husband had been right about everything: the fire safety failures, the system breakdowns, the preventable nature of the disaster. His methodical documentation during those final terrible hours had created an evidentiary foundation that no amount of corporate legal maneuvering could shake. The criminal investigation represented more than legal accountability, was recognition that David's death had meaning, that his sacrifice had purpose, that the truth he died documenting would finally be heard by people with the power to deliver justice. The text financial records that emerged during legal discovery revealed the brutal calculus behind David's death. Internal company documents showed that executives had calculated the potential legal costs of fire-related incidents and determined that settling wrongful death claims would be cheaper than manufacturing safer insulation materials. A particularly damning spreadsheet, created by Celatex's risk management team, quantified the cost-benefit analysis of using fire-resistant versus standard insulation in high-rise buildings. The scenario planning residential fire incidents document estimated that a major fire causing 10 to 50 fatalities would result in maximum legal settlements of £50 million, while reformulating their insulation for fire resistance would cost £73 million in research and production changes. They had literally calculated that it was more profitable to let people die than to make safer products. The document had been prepared for a board meeting in March 2016, 3 months before Grenfell Tower's deadly refurbishment was completed. Board minutes from that meeting showed executives voting unanimously to maintain current product specifications despite identified residential fire risks. Chairman James Thompson was recorded saying, "Regulatory compliance provides adequate legal protection. Additional safety measures represent unnecessary cost burden." Similar calculations appeared in documents from other companies involved in the project. Ridden Construction had performed litigation cost modeling that weighed potential manslaughter charges against profit margins from using cheaper materials. Their analysis concluded that criminal liability risk is acceptable given regulatory, environment, and historical prosecution rates for construction industry offenses. Arconic's internal communications revealed the most shocking callousness. Technical reports from 2014 explicitly warned that their cladding panels would spread fire rapidly in high-rise residential applications. But marketing teams continued promoting the product for exactly those uses. Sales Director Carolyn Mills had written to colleagues, "Market demand for cost-effective cladding solutions exceeds safety concerns. Customer education about appropriate applications is not our responsibility, not their responsibility." 72 people, including David, had died because companies decided that customer safety was not their responsibility. The financial documents also revealed an international pattern of dangerous behavior. The same companies had been involved in fires in Australia, the United Arab Emirates, and France, where similar cladding systems had caused deaths and injuries. Each incident had resulted in legal settlements that were treated as routine business expenses rather than warnings about deadly products. A particularly disturbing discovery was evidence of industry coordination to suppress fire safety research. Internal emails showed executives from multiple companies agreeing to fund studies that would minimize apparent fire risks, while avoiding research that might reveal the true dangers of their products. The construction industry had actively worked to prevent the kind of independent analysis that Dr. Lane had eventually provided. Expert testimony from Professor Luke Bisbee, a fire safety engineer from the University of Edinburgh, explained how the industry's financial incentives had created a race to the bottom in building safety. Companies competed to provide the cheapest materials that would technically meet minimum regulations. He testified there was no market incentive for exceeding safety standards, only for finding the least expensive way to achieve regulatory compliance. The profit margins revealed in the financial documents were staggering. Celotex had earned a 340% markup on the insulation used at Grenfell compared to fire-resistant alternatives. Arconic's cladding panels generated 280% higher profits than safer zinc systems. Ridden Construction had increased their project profit margin from 12% to 31%. Through specification changes that prioritized cost over safety, David and 71 other people had died, so that corporate executives could maximize quarterly earnings, reports, and annual bonuses. The international scope of the company's operations meant that criminal accountability would have global implications. Arconic was a US-based multinational with operations across Europe. Celotex was owned by French building materials giant Cinco. Ridden had subsidiaries in multiple countries where similar construction practices were common. Criminal convictions in the UK would trigger regulatory investigations worldwide, potentially affecting billions of dollars in construction contracts and forcing safety improvements across the global building industry. The companies were fighting not just for individual executives' freedom but for business models that treated safety as an optional expense rather than a fundamental requirement. As evidence of the company's calculations became public, international investors began demanding accountability from corporate boards. Share prices fell as institutional investors recognized the legal and reputational risks of the construction industry's approach to fire safety. Insurance companies started requiring detailed fire safety audits before providing coverage for high-rise projects. The financial pressure was forcing changes that regulatory action had failed to achieve. Companies were reformulating products, updating safety standards, and implementing new oversight procedures not because regulators demanded it, but because continued negligence had become financially unsustainable. But for those of us who had lost loved ones, the corporate accountability process was about more than financial consequences. It was about recognition that David and the others had been killed by deliberate choices made by people who valued profit over human life. The spreadsheets and financial models revealed the moral vacuum at the heart of the construction industry, a system where human deaths were acceptable losses in the pursuit of maximum profitability. Executives had known their products would kill people in foreseeable circumstances, and they had decided those deaths were an acceptable cost of doing business. David's video documentation had exposed not just technical failures, but the human consequences of a system that treated working-class lives as expendable. His methodical recording of safety failures had created evidence that would force corporate executives to face criminal accountability for their lethal calculations. The numbers in those financial documents weren't just profit margins, they were the price these companies had placed on my husband's life. Now they would discover that justice couldn't be calculated on a spreadsheet or dismissed with a quarterly settlement payment. The victim impact statement I wrote for David took me 3 weeks to complete. How do you distill a life, a love, and a loss into words that will be read in a courtroom to strangers who never knew the man whose death they're judging? How do you make corporate executives understand that their spreadsheet calculations had a face, a name, a future that was stolen? I wrote dozens of drafts, each one inadequate to capture who David had been. The legal guidelines were clinical. Describe the impact of the crime on your life. Explain your relationship to the deceased. Outline how the loss has affected you practically and emotionally. But David wasn't just the deceased, he was the man who made me coffee every morning, who called me superwoman when I worked late helping families in crisis, who believed so deeply in justice that he spent his final hour documenting evidence for a truth he'd never lived to see vindicated. My final draft began. David Blackburn was my husband, my best friend, and my moral compass. He died on June 14, 2017. Not because of an accident or act of God, but because people in positions of trust chose profit over his life. He spent his final hour creating evidence of the criminal negligence that killed him, believing that someone with authority would listen and act to prevent other deaths. The preparation process was emotionally brutal but legally necessary. Crown Prosecutor Sarah Williams walked me through what would happen during the trial. how the defense teams would likely challenge David's evidence, and how my testimony would fit into the broader case for corporate manslaughter. Your husband's videos are the strongest evidence we have, she explained. But the defense will try to argue that he wasn't qualified to assess building safety systems. That's where Dr. Lane's technical validation became crucial. Her forensic analysis had confirmed that every one of David's observations was technically accurate and legally relevant. His videos weren't just the desperate recordings of a dying man, they were expert-level documentation of criminal safety failures by someone who understood building systems and fire evacuation procedures. The legal team prepared me for the defense strategies we'd face. Corporate lawyers would argue that their clients had followed building regulations and couldn't be held responsible for regulatory inadequacies. They'd claim that the fire was an unforeseeable accident, that no one could have predicted the specific combination of factors that led to the disaster. But our evidence was overwhelming. David's videos showed the fire was entirely foreseeable. Residents had been warning about safety problems for years. The internal corporate documents revealed that companies knew their products created fire risks in high-rise residential buildings. The financial analysis proved they had chosen cheaper, more dangerous materials despite knowing the potential consequences. Media coverage of the approaching trial was intense and generally supportive of our position. Editorial pages across the political spectrum endorsed criminal accountability for corporate decisions that had caused preventable deaths. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for convicting executives who had prioritized profits over safety. But the emotional toll of reliving David's death through legal proceedings was enormous. Every document review session, every evidence presentation, every legal strategy meeting forced me to confront the details of how he had died and why. The clinical language of criminal law, the deceased, the incident, the defendants couldn't capture the human reality of what we'd lost. Support came from unexpected places. Grenfell United had grown into a powerful advocacy organization representing all the bereaved families, and we drew strength from shared determination to see justice done. Other victims of corporate negligence reached out, sharing experiences, from cases involving pharmaceutical companies, industrial accidents, and environmental disasters. The international attention was remarkable. Legal observers from around the world were watching the Grenfell prosecutions as a potential precedent for holding multinational corporations criminally accountable for safety failures. Similar cladding systems were being removed from buildings in Australia, Canada, and across Europe as governments recognized the fire risks that had killed David and the others. The trial preparation revealed just how extensive the corporate conspiracy had been. Evidence showed coordination not just during the original construction project, but continuing through the cover-up efforts after the fire. Companies had shared legal strategies, coordinated public relations responses, and even attempted to influence the scope of official investigations. Most disturbing was evidence that some defendants had continued selling dangerous cladding systems to other projects even after the Grenfell fire, knowing that similar disasters could occur elsewhere. Corporate emails showed executives discussing managing liability exposure from potential future fires, rather than removing dangerous products from the market. The prosecution's case was built around three core arguments. The defendants knew their products and decisions created serious fire risks. They proceeded anyway because of financial incentives, and their negligence directly caused the deaths at Grenfell Tower. David's videos provided crucial evidence for all three elements, documenting the safety failures that had been predictable and preventable. As the trial date approached, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. This was what David had died trying to achieve, accountability for the people whose negligence had killed him. His methodical documentation during those final terrible hours was finally going to be tested in the most serious legal forum possible. The victim impact statement in my purse felt like carrying David's voice into the courtroom, ensuring that the human cost of corporate negligence wouldn't be lost in technical discussions of building regulations and profit margins. The executives who had calculated that his death was an acceptable business expense were about to discover that justice couldn't be bought, buried, or dismissed with legal technicalities. David's evidence would speak for itself, and through it, he would finally get the hearing he had died trying to create. The Old Bailey's Court. Number 1 fell silent as Mr. Justice Holroyd began reading the verdicts on March 15, 2019, 21 months after David's death. After endless legal proceedings and corporate attempts to avoid accountability, We were finally going to learn whether the British legal system could deliver justice for preventable deaths caused by corporate negligence. Has the jury reached verdicts upon which you are all agreed? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor, responded the jury foreman, a middle-aged woman who had listened to 6 weeks of evidence with careful attention. On the charge of corporate manslaughter against Ridden Construction Limited, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. The word hit me like a physical blow. Guilty. After all the denials, the legal maneuvering, the attempts to blame everyone except themselves, the company that had chosen deadly cladding to increase their profit margins had been found criminally responsible for David's death, on the charge of corporate manslaughter against Celotex Limited. Guilty, Your Honor. Maria Santos, sitting beside me, began crying quietly. Her son Carlos had died because this company had known their insulation would spread fire rapidly in high-rise buildings and had sold it anyway, calculating that legal settlements would be cheaper than making safer products. On the charge of corporate manslaughter against Arconic Architectural Products. Guilty, Your Honor. 343. Every company that had prioritized profit over safety, that had known their products would kill people in foreseeable circumstances, had been found criminally liable for the 72 deaths at Grenfell Tower. But the individual verdicts were what we'd really been waiting for. Corporate entities could pay fines and continue operating. Only individual executives could face prison sentences that would send a real message about personal accountability for corporate crimes. On the charge of gross negligence, manslaughter, against Robert Black, the TMO operations director who had dismissed residents' safety concerns and coordinated the post-fire cover-up, sat motionless as the jury foreman announced, Guilty, Your Honor. Stephen Blake from Ridden Construction, who had pushed for the cheapest possible cladding system despite knowing the fire risks. Guilty, Your Honor. James Thompson, the Celotex chairman who had voted to maintain dangerous product specifications after reviewing casualty projections. Guilty, Your Honor. Caroline Mills from Arcnetic, who had marketed cladding panels for residential use while knowing they would spread fire rapidly. Guilty, Your Honor. 12 individual executives in total, from senior corporate managers to council officials, all found guilty of gross negligence, manslaughter for decisions that had directly caused the deaths of David and 71 other people. The verdicts were read in alphabetical order by defendant name, but I was hearing them in the order of our evidence. David's videos proving the safety failures, the paper trail of ignored warnings, the internal documents revealing corporate knowledge of fire risks, the financial calculations that had valued profit over human life. Every piece of evidence we'd fought to preserve and present had been validated by 12 ordinary citizens who had listened carefully to the facts and reached the obvious conclusion. These people had killed our loved ones through criminal negligence. Justice Holroyd's sentencing remarks were measured but firm. The defendants' decisions were not merely negligent, they were criminally reckless with predictable and devastating consequences. The evidence shows clear knowledge of serious fire risks, deliberate choices to proceed despite those risks for financial reasons, and conscious disregard for the safety of residents whose lives depended on the defendant's professional competence and legal obligations. The sentences reflected the severity of the crimes. 8 to 12 years imprisonment for the executives, who had made the key decisions about dangerous materials. 4 to 6 years for those who had implemented and covered up the negligent choices. Robert Black, whose coordination of the post-fire cover-up had constituted additional criminal conspiracy, received the maximum sentence of 14 years. Corporate fines totaled £890 million, not just compensation for the families, but punitive damages designed to eliminate any financial benefit from the criminal negligence. The companies would also face permanent oversight of their safety practices and regular audits to ensure compliance with enhanced building standards. But the most important victory was the legal precedent these convictions established. For the first time in British legal history, corporate executives had faced serious prison sentences for safety decisions that prioritized profit over human life. The convictions would reverberate through boardrooms and construction sites across the world, creating new incentives for corporate safety compliance. After the verdicts were announced, I stood outside the Old Bailey with the other bereaved families, reading a statement we had prepared together. Today, justice has been served for the 72 people who died at Grenfell Tower. These convictions prove that our loved ones were killed by criminal negligence, not by accident or regulatory failure. David Blackburn and the others died because people in positions of trust chose profit over their lives. Today, those people have been held accountable. The media coverage was extensive and positive. Editorial pages praised the convictions as a watershed moment for corporate accountability. Legal experts described the case as establishing crucial precedents for prosecuting safety-related corporate crimes. International observers noted that similar prosecutions were now likely in other countries facing building safety scandals. That evening, alone in my flat, I watched David's final video one more time, his calm voice documenting the safety failures that were killing him, his methodical approach to creating evidence even as he faced death. His final words about not letting them forget all had led to this moment of accountability. The verdicts couldn't bring David back, couldn't undo the trauma of losing him, couldn't erase the horror of that night in June 2017, but they proved that his sacrifice had meaning, that his final hour of documentation had achieved exactly what he had hoped, forcing the people responsible for his death to face the consequences of their criminal choices. Justice had been delivered, not just for David, but for every person whose life had been cut short by corporate negligence at Grenfell Tower. The legal system had finally recognized that working-class lives were worth more than corporate profit margins, that safety couldn't be treated as an optional expense, that criminal negligence would face criminal consequences. David's voice, preserved in those shaky videos from our burning building, had spoken truth to power and won. The David Blackburn Safety Foundation was formally established on June 14, 2019. Exactly 2 years after the fire that took his life, the Foundation's charter, signed by Housing Secretary James Brokenshire and witnessed by representatives from all the bereaved families, created the legal framework for the most comprehensive building safety reforms in British history. The charter document, which I keep framed in my office, begins with words that would have made David proud, in memory of David Blackburn and the 71 other victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. This foundation is established to ensure that no family will ever again lose loved ones to preventable building safety failures. Their deaths will not be forgotten, and their sacrifice will save lives. The Foundation's first initiative was implementing the Residence Voice Protocol, mandatory consultation requirements that give tenants direct input into all building safety decisions affecting their homes. Social housing providers must now respond formally to resident safety concerns within 30 days, with independent oversight ensuring that complaints aren't dismissed or ignored as they had been at Grenfell. This was David's victory, 2 years too late. The man who had documented maintenance problems in his careful notebook, who had submitted formal complaints about fire doors and emergency systems, who had tried to protect his neighbors through proper channels, his approach was finally being recognized as essential to building safety. The protocol requires that all high-rise residential buildings have elected resident safety officers with direct access to building management, fire services, and regulatory authorities. These officers receive training in fire safety principles, building systems, and emergency procedures. Most importantly, they have legal protection against retaliation for raising safety concerns. I attended the first training session for resident safety officers, watching 40 people from social housing developments across London learn skills that could prevent future disasters. Many were immigrants, working-class parents, elderly residents, people whose voices had been systematically ignored by the housing system, but who knew their buildings better than any external inspector ever could. You are the eyes and ears of building safety, I told them during my presentation about David's documentation methods. Your observations matter. Your concerns are valid. Your voices can save lives. I showed them clips from David's videos, explaining how his methodical approach to documenting problems had created crucial evidence. Several participants took notes on his techniques, recognizing their importance. The Foundation's second major initiative was establishing new building standards that eliminated the regulatory gaps that had allowed Grenfell to become a death trap. The David Blackburn building safety standards require fire-resistant materials in all high-rise residential construction, mandate multiple protected evacuation routes, and establish strict oversight of refurbishment projects. These standards go far beyond minimum regulatory compliance, creating positive incentives for exceeding safety requirements rather than finding the cheapest way to meet basic rules. Companies that implement enhanced safety measures receive recognition and preferred contractor status. While those with safety violations face automatic exclusion from public housing projects, the international impact has been remarkable. Countries across Europe, Australia, Canada, and parts of the United States have adopted similar standards, often referencing the Grenfell case and David's documentation as evidence of why enhanced building safety is essential. The Foundation receives regular communications from international housing advocates who credit our work with preventing disasters in their own countries. My transformation from grieving widow to national safety advocate still surprises me sometimes. I never intended to become a public figure, never wanted to speak at conferences or testify to parliamentary committees. But David's videos had given me a mission I couldn't abandon, ensuring that his death would prevent other deaths. The work is emotionally difficult, but deeply meaningful. Every building that's made safer because of new standards, every resident whose concerns are taken seriously because of the protocols we've established, every life that's saved because of enhanced fire safety measures, all represent David's continuing impact on the world. That recognition has come from unexpected places. The Royal Institute of British Architects awarded the Foundation their gold medal for contributions to building safety. The International Association of Fire Chiefs created the David Blackburn Award for excellence in fire prevention. Most meaningfully, residents from social housing developments across the UK regularly write to thank us for giving them voices in decisions that affect their safety. One letter that particularly moved me came from Amara Hassan, a young mother living in a tower block in Birmingham that had been retrofitted with fire-resistant cladding because of our safety standards. "My daughter is 3 years old," she wrote. "She will grow up in a building that is safe because of your husband's sacrifice. She will never know how close she came to living in a death trap, but I will never forget that your family's loss protected mine." The Foundation's work has also focused on memorial and remembrance. We've established educational programs that teach building safety principles in schools, ensuring that future generations understand the importance of proper construction standards and resident advocacy. David's story is now part of the curriculum in architectural and engineering programs across the UK. The memorial garden we created at the Grenfell site includes a section dedicated to David's documentation work, with quotes from his videos etched in stone. "Someone needs to know this wasn't just an accident. The compartmentation has failed. Don't let them forget." His words, spoken in the face of death, now serve as permanent reminders of the importance of truth-telling and evidence preservation. But perhaps David's greatest legacy is the change in how British society views corporate accountability and resident rights. The successful criminal prosecutions establish precedents that have been applied to other cases involving safety negligence. Companies now face real consequences for prioritizing profit over human life, and residents have legal tools to ensure their safety concerns are addressed. Every time I speak at a conference or visit a housing development implementing our safety protocols, I think about David's belief in the power of ordinary people to create change through careful documentation and persistent advocacy. He died trying to create evidence that would prevent future deaths, and that evidence has now saved countless lives he'll never meet. David's legacy isn't just the foundation that bears his name or the safety standards that grew from his sacrifice. His legacy is the proof that individual voices matter, that careful documentation can defeat corporate power, and that truth-telling, even in the face of death, can change the world for the better. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 2022, 5 years after David's death, written in careful handwriting on university letterhead. It was from Rebecca Chen, a 22-year-old fire safety engineering student at Imperial College London. Her words reminded me why David's story continues to matter in ways I never could have imagined. "Dear Mrs. Blackburn," she wrote, "I am in my final year studying fire safety engineering. Inspired by your husband's documentation of the Grenfell Tower fire, his videos, which we studied extensively in our Building Safety and Human Behavior module, showed me how technical knowledge combined with moral courage can save lives. I have decided to dedicate my career to preventing similar tragedies, particularly in social housing where residents' voices are often ignored." Rebecca's letter went on to describe her thesis project: developing advanced fire detection systems specifically designed for buildings with vulnerable populations. Her research was building on lessons learned from David's documentation, creating technology that would give residents early warning and emergency services better information during building fires. Your husband proved that residents are the most important fire safety experts in any building, she concluded. They know when something is wrong, they understand how systems really work in practice, and they deserve to be heard. I want to create technology that amplifies their voices rather than replacing them. Thank you for ensuring his sacrifice leads to better protection for people like my own family who live in social housing. Letters like Rebecca's arrive regularly now, from students, housing advocates, fire safety professionals, and ordinary residents who have been empowered by David's example to speak up about safety concerns in their own buildings. Each one reminds me that grief, when channeled toward justice, can create ripple effects that touch lives across generations and continents. The healing process has been gradual and incomplete. There are still mornings when I wake up reaching for David's warmth beside me, still moments when I want to share some small observation or victory with the person who would understand it best. The grief never disappears entirely, it just transforms into something more manageable, more purposeful. Therapy helped me understand that survival guilt was a normal response to losing someone whose death had meaning beyond our personal relationship. David's final hour of documentation had saved lives, prevented future disasters, and changed building safety practices worldwide. His death wasn't senseless, it was tragic, but transformative. Learning to accept that transformation as worthy of his sacrifice was part of my healing journey. The Foundation's work continues to expand. We've established international partnerships with housing advocacy organizations in 12 countries. The David Blackburn building safety standards have been adopted across the European Union. Resident safety officer training programs operate in Australia, Canada, and several U.S. states. David's approach to systematic safety documentation is now taught in emergency management courses worldwide, but the most meaningful progress has been personal. I've learned to build a life that honors David's memory while embracing new possibilities for joy and connection. I've returned to social work, specializing in helping families navigate housing disputes and safety concerns. I've developed close friendships with other bereaved family members who understand the unique challenges of losing someone to preventable institutional negligence. Romance seemed impossible for years after David's death. How do you explain to someone that your husband died creating evidence of corporate crimes? That your relationship is built on a foundation of justice, advocacy, and public testimony? But gradually, I've learned that love and loss can coexist. That building new relationships doesn't diminish the importance of what I've shared with David. The memorial visits to Grenfell have become easier, less overwhelming. I still go every month, usually with other family members, sometimes alone. The site has been transformed into a beautiful memorial garden, with individual tributes to each person who died. David's section includes his camera, symbolizing his role as a documenter of truth, and quotes from residents whose lives have been saved by the safety reforms his videos inspired. Standing at that memorial, I often think about the larger meaning of what we've accomplished. Grenfell was a preventable tragedy that revealed systemic failures in how British society protects its most vulnerable residents. David's documentation and our subsequent advocacy forced those systems to change in ways that will protect future generations. The criminal convictions established precedents for corporate accountability that extend far beyond building safety. The resident advocacy protocols we developed have been applied to other areas of social housing management. The international attention to our case has inspired similar reforms in countries facing their own building safety crises. Most importantly, we've proven that individual voices matter, that careful documentation can defeat corporate power, that persistent advocacy can create systematic change. David believed in the possibility of justice even as he faced death, and that belief has been vindicated through years of legal victories and policy reforms. The future holds new challenges and opportunities. Climate change is creating new fire risks that require innovative safety approaches. Immigration and urbanization are increasing pressure on social housing systems worldwide. Economic inequality continues to create situations where vulnerable populations live in substandard conditions. But we've also proven that change is possible when people refuse to accept preventable deaths as inevitable tragedies. David's legacy provides a roadmap for advocacy. Document problems carefully, demand accountability persistently, build coalitions strategically, and never accept that working-class lives are expendable. His final video message, "Don't let them forget," has become our ongoing mission. We won't let them forget that corporate negligence kills people. We won't let them forget that residents' voices matter. We won't let them forget that safety is a human right, not a luxury good available only to those who can afford it. David's death was a tragedy that should never have happened, but his final hour of documentation has created a legacy of protection for countless people he never met. That transformation of personal loss into public safety represents the best possible outcome from an unbearable situation. Every life saved by enhanced building standards, every resident empowered to speak up about safety concerns, every corporation forced to prioritize human welfare over profit margins, all represent David's continuing presence in a world he helped make safer through his sacrifice. His voice, preserved in those shaky videos from our burning building, continues to speak for justice, for accountability, and for the fundamental principle that every person deserves to be safe in their own home.